Welcome. My name is Kim Molinitz. I'm the director of the Air Force Negotiation and Dispute Resolution Program. We are a part of the General Counsel's Office located in Crystal City, Virginia. Thank you so much for joining this webinar on negotiating difficult conversations. I'd like to introduce JSA's Dispute Resolution Specialist, Michael Wolf. He'll be working with me today to present today's session. It's entitled Successful Strategies for Negotiating Difficult Conversations. At this time, I'll turn the program over to Michael so we can get started. Michael?
Thank you, Kim, and welcome everyone. Think back to a recent difficult conversation, one that went off the rails. Maybe it started without drama and became progressively more challenging. Or maybe it escalated in a single moment. What made it difficult? Was it the subject matter? Maybe the way that the other person felt about the subject matter? Did you keep your emotions in check? Was timing or events outside your control? Were those possible causes? So take a moment and just think what made that conversation most difficult. Conflict is inevitable. Some conflict becomes drama-filled conversations. How you engage can determine mission success and your success. In this webinar, you will learn strategies to prevent discussions from going bad and to repair those that go horribly wrong. Difficult conversations are inevitable. They happen with people at work, people who you work for, people who work with you. They happen, all around. And it's tempting to label them, dismiss them, or simply avoid people that you get in conflict with. Of course, that's not very effective in the workplace, and it gets in the way of accomplishing the mission. Now, here on the screen, you'll see some behaviors that frequently cause conversations to go bad. Do you recognize any? I do. These things happen all the time. They happen all around us. Now, whether something really happens or whether it's something that is perceived to have occurred, that's probably not what's most important. For example, someone might feel like I don't support them even when I think that I'm doing everything possible to give them appropriate support. We cannot control how others feel, but we can try to act in ways that influence the way that others perceive our actions.
The most important thing you can do to improve any conversation is to listen actively. You probably already knew that. And at this point in your career, you might have even taken a class to help you listen more actively. If so, you already know the difference between hearing and listening. Hear is something we do with our ears, while listen is something we do with our brains. Hearing is a way to capture words, while listening is a way to capture meaning. So what happens when we filter out certain words or apply a meaning that the speaker didn't intend? What happens when we make assumptions or we draw conclusions based on our own experiences rather than the conclusions and experiences that the person is trying to communicate to us? A good conversation might unintentionally become difficult. What you see on the slide in front of you is a 6-part strategy that's going to help you change the direction of those difficult conversations. The important part is that we're trying to create a toolbox for you. You won't need to use all 6 of these strategies in every conversation, and in fact, not all approaches work in every situation. What you want to do is think about which of these elements will help you in your circumstance. Using the approach that makes the conversation more productive, maybe even more collaborative, and at a minimum, more professional. So let's take them one at a time. We're going to start with the L for language. Now, you already know that communication is not just about words. It's also about body language, and it's about what we don't say. In fact, it matters how we say things. It matters a lot. If I say, "Excuse me," That can have a very different impact than if I say, "Excuse me." We are more likely to hear criticism as constructive if the speaker begins the word I rather than the word you. These are called I statements. For example, a subordinate could walk into your office and say, "You wrote a really confusing report." The subordinate can hear what you said as derogatory and demeaning, resulting in a potentially difficult conversation. What if instead you said, "I had difficulty understanding your report"? The subordinate in that case is more likely to hear this I statement as inquisitive and constructive, resulting in that person being less defensive and more receptive to your observations. If you want to avoid unnecessarily difficult conversations, express yourself using I statements rather than you statements. Here's another tip. Avoid using overly broad generalizations like always and never. For example, "You're always late for everything," or "You never seem to be working." Both statements are probably overbroad, regardless of legitimate concerns about that person's work habits. The listener is likely to become defensive, and the conversation goes downhill from there. All it takes is for that individual to think of one or two circumstances where that doesn't hold to be true, and it invalidates your point. Now let's shift to thinking about words that shut down a conversation. We should try to avoid using those words or phrases that shut things down, like, "That's it, I'm done." Now think for a moment in your own personal experience. Have you ever had a phrase or a circumstance where somebody said something that made you think that the conversation was over? How did that feel? What did that make you think about in that circumstance? Now you also want to consider avoiding generic statements. As you do that, I'll talk a bit about statements like, "I understand," "I hear you," "I know how you feel." Aren't those the kind of statements that can shut down a conversation right away? It's one thing to hear that someone you know is supportive and has your back, but what does a generic statement sound like coming from someone you're not sure is really your friend or your foe? Especially during a discussion that is already a bit tense, think twice before making such a generic statement. Instead, demonstrate understanding or compassion by accurately summarizing what the speaker said, or even repeating what they said verbatim. If the speaker uses a long-winded way to describe how they feel, try to reflect that feeling in a word or phrase. Again, use care here. When the listener gets it right, it goes a long way towards showing that the listener is really listening. Now, there are times when generalizations and generic statements are appropriate, but there are also times when they're counterproductive. If in doubt, try one of the tools we just shared with you. Now let's talk a little bit about lifting the language or making better choices. As we continue, take a look at the statements on the left side of the screen and think a little bit about how you might say those things differently. When you look at a phrase like, "You're a nitpicker," that's really labeling that other person. How does that make them feel? What might you say instead? Well, one option is, "Detail's important to you, isn't it?" It's an observation that gets to the root of the same issue. What about an accusatory statement like, "You're lying"? How does that make the other person feel or respond? An alternative might be, "I understand that differently. Can I tell you what I recall about that?" There's also undermining statements. "Well, that's not the way we did it when Sandy was here." Where there may be an honest objection here you want to make. "I don't think that's the way it should be done based on my experience." You might result with people who have demanding statements like, "Just do what I ask." How does that land with an employee? Whereas you might look at an assignment. What are barriers to you that would stop you from completing this by Friday at noon? Finally, there are insulting and demeaning statements like, I should have known you couldn't do this." What if we replace that with something like, "It doesn't seem like you understand what's needed here. Can I tell you how I'd like it done and then follow up with that in writing?" It's important that we think about how our language choices are experienced by the listener. But language isn't the only thing that's important. So I'd like to ask Michael to talk to you a little bit about our next letter, and that's I for identity.
Kim, there's no faster way for a conversation to fall apart than to challenge someone's identity. Identity is how we see ourselves, and it's the way we're perceived by others. Identity can be shaped by the segment of the population we identify with, and at work it can also be influenced by relationships with those around us, as well as with our experiences, our values, and our beliefs. Our formal and informal roles at work, and the authority that goes along with those roles, also help shape our identity at work. Now, if I see myself as a high performer and you try to counsel me about my performance, how might I react when I perceive that as a challenge to an important part of my identity? You might not have intended to attack me or my identity, and my defensiveness might also be unconscious, but the rest of our conversation might not go so well. To minimize these types of difficult conversations, be aware of the roles that we cast others into and any disconnect with the way that we view ourselves and that the way they view themselves. Let's say a conflict erupts between two coworkers and I take a role in helping them through it. Have you done that before? Many of us have. Now, once we do that, we need to consider how our actions fit with the role that we're cast in. And not just what we think about our role, but how do they perceive us? So, for example, what if I am in the role of a peacemaker? Well, I don't have a stake in the conflict as a peacemaker. I can listen to my coworkers, I can help them listen to each other, and try to help them explore their own solutions. Now, contrast that to being in the role of a problem solver. Again, not just whether I see myself as a problem solver, but what if they see me as a problem solver? And as a problem solver, my role changes a bit. It might involve, for example, suggesting solutions that a peacemaker is not going to do. Will I now be viewed as having a stake in my coworkers adopting or successfully implementing my suggestions? Especially if they work for me, that could happen. So how should that affect the actions that I choose to take? Understanding our roles and the roles of others really helps us understand why some conversations become difficult, and it helps us strategize what to do.
Another key thing we need to think about is the structure of these conversations. The first thing is we need to think about who are the stakeholders in the actual conversations. Conversations can break down if we're missing essential participants or if we have people involved who really shouldn't be. So let's first think about who. We're all very familiar with praise in public, criticize in private. Handle conflict and discipline in private with only those who are involved and those who have a need to know. Have you ever been in a meeting or received an all-hands email where everyone is cautioned to not do what virtually everyone already knows not to do? When one person or a small group does something wrong, in general, have that difficult conversation with them and only them. You also want to think about when. Meet as soon as you have necessary information and authority to act, and you can secure those necessary participants. Delays often make the situation much worse. Timing matters too. Now, if you're like most of us, you might get frustrated because of how much time it takes to deal with conflicts at work. And you're right, it does take time. But lingering workplace conflict is not just uncomfortable, it can be significantly impairing our ability to accomplish the mission. It lowers morale and productivity and adds to further communication breakdowns. Now consider how much time you'll spend revisiting an unresolved issue over and over again, and how much more time it takes after a problem escalates. In fact, I would say also consider that there are certain circumstances where you can particularly identify an issue or two that needs to be handled immediately and put the rest of that conversation off until the conversation time is right. I suggest we don't have time not to deal with conflict. Now, one last point before we move on. Be prepared. If you find that you need more information, authority, support, or someone else's involvement, take a break from the conversation, then resume it as soon as possible. Now let's all think a little bit more about some other common guidelines. Now there's going to be some great information here on the screen, and I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but I do want you to be able to see a couple of these while we're talking. Now let's take a quick look at meeting guidelines and what can support constructive discussions. Now while I continue, also take a few moments to think about what are some guidelines you've used yourself to support a more constructive discussion. We know that stress makes it difficult to keep our thoughts straight and to feel like our priorities will be addressed. Creating a framework for the discussion helps us know what to expect and that our priorities will actually be discussed. This might include some of the guidelines you see on the screen. Now we want to agree on guidelines with the people we're talking with rather than imposing those on others. And do so before you begin so that they don't appear as punishment for wrongdoing. Now finally, under structure, I want to talk about a little bit where these conversations should happen. Consider privacy, distractions, and location. As tempting as it might be to meet in your office, if there's a really tough conversation, perhaps a more neutral space can help all of the participants be less affected by things such as turf and power. Remember, the purpose of this conversation is to effect some sort of change in behavior or action, and we are working towards creating the conditions to make that more likely. These are frequent contributors to good meetings gone bad, and if you cannot set the stage in advance, consider moving the discussion if a better location is available. You could say something like, "Shall we move into the conference room? It might be more comfortable in there."
T stands for topics in our LISTEN acronym. Listen to the following scenario, and if you have a pen and paper, be ready to jot down the number of topics that you hear Jason identify as Jason is rambling on to his supervisor. Here's Jason. Jason thinks he's being set up for failure again. The latest thing is that he was late completing the audit reports, but that was because he couldn't figure out how to use the new software. According to Jason, his boss couldn't find time to help him. Jason knows he's going to catch it, and he's afraid his boss is not going to be interested in hearing anything about the software. Jason feels like he did everything he could and has a good reason for being late. He also wants his boss to understand what's not working with the software because they're going to be using it to track progress all year long. Jason is about ready to yell at his boss and say something like, "Listen to me for a change." Okay, that's the end of the scenario. How many topics did you identify? Now, when Jason's supervisor first heard a rambling monologue like this, it seemed difficult to even figure out where to start. Was Jason most concerned about defending the timeliness of his work? Or was he unable to get help? Or did Jason think his supervisor did not want to know about the software problems? Rather than mingle everything into a confusing conversation, Jason's supervisor realized that she needed to have 3 different conversations with him. One was about timeliness of completing Jason's work. A second conversation needed to be about the software. And a third needed to be about Jason and his need to get help. So Jason's supervisor identified those 3 buckets in which she could put all those topics and have meaningful conversations. Whenever possible, consider separating each topic that could become difficult and work in smaller chunks without losing sight of the big picture. This enables you to set priorities and determine how to talk constructively about problems and solutions. Priorities help you determine where to start and how to proceed. Some topics will clearly stand out as needing to be addressed before others. I suggest that you seek concurrence from the person or persons you're talking with when you put such topics on the top of the agenda. Make sure that if possible, that others share your priority of topics. Otherwise, they're going to be thinking about their priorities as you're talking to someone who's not listening about your priorities. Now, if there's an easy topic that you can use to achieve a quick win, why don't you consider putting that near the top of the list after talking about those first ones that clearly stand out needing to be addressed before others. If you can get some quick wins early on, it's going to help you build momentum to deal with those topics that are most difficult and risky, yet possibly are also most important. After you've gained some traction and momentum with those easy and clear win topics, then you're probably ready to plan, prepare, and make a commitment to expend undistracted time working towards success on the most difficult topics.
Now we're going to talk about emotion. When something at work is absolutely amazing, we can feel on top of the world. In fact, a high-performance workplace cannot exist without passion for what we do. And that passion is actually an emotion. So emotion in the workplace is necessary for the high-performance place we all know we want to work. At the other end of the spectrum, most of us have felt angry or disappointed by something that happened at work. We might be all about the mission, but we are also humans, and we don't check our emotions at the door. Now think about a difficult conversation you've had. Have you wanted to avoid that? Have you been frustrated? Have you been angry? All of those things are emotion too. Now research shows that a strong emotional response diverts chemical resources away from the part of our brain that is responsible for rational thought and executive functioning. Effective decision-making is actually diminished, and it becomes harder to distinguish good from bad, friend from foe, or rationally anticipate future consequences of our actions. And the worst part of it is, at the moment, we don't even realize that's happening. But others around us can probably see those signs. Grinding teeth, flushed faces, upset stomachs, voices trembling, arms crossed, shallow breathing. Have you ever seen these behaviors in yourself or others? What can you do when a necessary participant feels so strongly about a matter that he or she can no longer constructively participate in that conversation? Now, first, you'll need to identify and deal with what you absolutely must address right now. Some things simply can't be put off. A safety issue, an urgent behavioral issue needs to be dealt with immediately. But there are many more things that actually can be tabled until both parties have been able to gather their thoughts, and have a more constructive conversation. Now, how do you make that happen? Consider using a phrase and using an I statement. Something like, I need a timeout, or I need to think more about this before we discuss this further. Don't ask for permission or agreement, unless of course you're required to do so. Give yourself or the other person a chance to recover and reset. Then continue as soon as everyone is ready.
Time to dive into the final element of the listen strategy. The N in listen stands for needs. For those of you who are familiar with interest-based problem solving and negotiations, you'll recognize that needs are closely aligned with interests. Think of needs in our listen strategy as the reason why participants feel strongly about what you're discussing. For example, the need to accomplish the mission in the way that it should be accomplished, the need to be heard, the need to feel respected, the need to feel like you're contributing and making a difference. These are things that people can care about strongly. Sometimes we share similar needs, and just as often our needs are very different. Even differing needs can be compatible with each other, while others are undeniably in conflict. Now, this is the really important point. The most successful resolutions involve satisfying as many legitimate needs as possible, both theirs and yours. Consider this to be your new definition of winning a difficult conversation. Satisfying as many needs as possible. Now that's not easy. It requires very specific skills and experience and practice. But like any skill, you become better the more you practice. The NDR office is a source for skill building on how to systematically use easy-to-learn techniques that can help airmen make better decisions and resolve conflicts at the earliest possible opportunity. In a moment, we're going to tell you how to contact the NDR office if you're interested in having this type of training offered at your installation. And Kim, maybe that might be something to pick up on even right now.
Absolutely. The Air Force Negotiation Center
And Kim, maybe that might be something to pick up on even right now.
Absolutely. The Air Force Negotiation Center partners with the General Counsel's Office and several partners at Air University to provide both classroom education, but education that we take out to the field in topics like negotiation and dispute resolution, as well as other webinars and online series that are available to help you. If you've accessed this webinar through our website, you may have already seen links to programs such as Skillport and MillSuite that will bring you to 7 online training courses to help you better utilize mediation. Now those are built a little differently than this one in that those are short 3 to 5 minute YouTube-like videos that have accompanying checklists. Now also, if you access this through our website, you'll notice there are several places where you can find out more information about our consulting services and our training services, and several ways in which we can provide assistance. Feel free to reach out at any time, and we'll help your organization design solutions to solve those problems that are causing issues for you. So let's take a second to come back up and wrap up what we've learned today about listening and how to prepare. Now, preparation is essential for success. Before entering a difficult conversation, collect your thoughts and use these listen techniques to adopt the best approach. The first thing to do is to understand what might have caused the conversation to become so difficult in the first place. Was it a language choice by one of the parties? Did somebody feel their identity was attacked? Was there a problem with the way the conversation was structured? Or did we try to handle too many topics at once and the important topics didn't get the emphasis needed? Was emotion something that caused individuals to either not hear one another or not be able to express themselves in a productive way? Or were some of the parties' needs not being met by the conversation itself? Were there several causes? Now you'll be able to go to this toolbox and get the right tools for the job. And remember, when handled well, conflict can be constructive and add value. Now, I'd also like to tell you that if you've downloaded this from our website, you'll notice that next to that, there's an ability to download a one-page handout that summarizes the key points of each of these listen strategies into one page. And we hope you can use it to help you remember these tools. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we ask that you check back with us on occasion because we will be putting out more of these training webinars throughout the coming months. Thanks so much, and have a great day.